so I don't forget. And by the way, everybody's being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, just let me know. Gerald, what?
What's your language?
No. That has nothing to do with it. You can say whatever you want, whenever you want. Because you're responsible for your own actions, and if you want that type of personality to be known to the world, that's up to you.
Not Jerry Axon.
No.
Yes. Yeah.
Remind everyone to mute themselves if they get a phone call.
Yeah, if they get a phone call, yeah. Thank you, Ken. You bet. You bet.
Right. Kurt is on the phone already.
Where's the mute button?
The mute button is usually on the
lower left-hand corner.
Yeah, well, for some reason, oh, okay. Yes, I see it now. Thank you.
All right. And if you do get a phone call, and believe it or not, I have control, so I can mute you.
Or you could hang up on my phone call. That's even better.
Can't do that.
What power you have, Andy?
I'm sorry, one more time?
I said, what power you have?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it's international in our case, too.
That's right. You're absolutely correct. And it is 7 o'clock. So for those that are here, we are going to start. Welcome, everyone. And we all appreciate you being here. This is the second of our discussions from the Jewish Educational. And I realize Zoom is not the best way to do it, especially when we've got football competing. But we're going to make this as enjoyable for you as long as you put the time in. So we are going to talk about the Jewish influence in the formation of the United States and in the formation of the laws of the United States. So with that being said, before I do all of this, share with us what you think the influence of Judaism is on the United States. And someone start me off, and I need participation. So what influence do you think the Jewish people, the Jewish heritage, the Jewish religion has on the U.S.? Roz, you've got your hand up.
I think in terms of education, the Jewish people were very much concerned with education. Unfortunately, initially it was only the men they were concerned with, but they were concerned with education. Okay, so education would be one. All right, someone else. In addition to education, what else? Good. It's a good teaching moment because you're going to learn something that you never knew before. So let's start all the way in the beginning.
10 Commandments.
10 Commandments. All right. And yep, good.
Don't ask me to recite them.
I'm sorry. No, I won't.
Don't ask me to recite them.
No, I won't ask you to recite them. Not to worry.
Just how many haven't you broken yet?
So we're not gonna get involved in that. So let's
start. Can I ask you something?
When
you're talking about government, are you talking about which levels of government? You've got 3 major levels of government in the U.S. So are you looking at the Jewish influence on federal, on constitutional things, or on state things, or on local municipal things?
Yes, yes, and yes. All of them. Yes, yes, and yes. Believe it or not. You betcha. But let's start all the way from the beginning, having to do with Christopher Columbus. Now, there's been lots of discussion whether Christopher Columbus was in fact Jewish or not. We're not going to really get involved in that. There's evidence both ways. And if you really want to study it, you can probably come to the conclusion that he was. And he was one of these, what they call converso Jews. What is a converso Jew? It is a Jew who converted to another religion because they didn't want to get killed. And as a result of that, they kept their Judaism secret. And when he wrote letters, on the top of every page, he wrote 2 Hebrew letters, the Beit and the apostrophe and the Hey, which in Hebrew means Baruch Hashem, and Orthodox Jews always write that when they write. Okay, so I'm not going to say he was Jewish, but there's enough evidence. However, the navigator on the ship was Jewish. And without that navigation equipment that was invented by Jews, he never would have found his way here. So part 1 is Jewish. Part 2, when he took people to go on the cruise, so to speak, he firmly believed that there would be people in the area that he would find. And what language do you think he thought people spoke in the New World? Anybody want to take a guess?
Hebrew?
Hebrew. And he brought with him a Hebrew translator, somebody who could translate into Hebrew so that he suspected he would be able to talk to people in Hebrew. Where would he ever come up with an idea like that? Well, there are some theories that suggest that the native Indians who were here, or the Native Americans, however you want to call them, I should do it correctly, they actually were Jewish. We can't prove that. Although in New Mexico, they have found Hebrew writings in caves long before Christopher Columbus ever came here. So then, of course, we have the magnificent holiday of Thanksgiving. Aha! What is Thanksgiving? Believe it or not, when the pilgrims came over, before they arrived, they actually spent one full year with Sephardic Jews in Europe. And the Sephardic Jews taught them everything about Judaism. All the holidays, the Torah, the Hebrew language, they were loaded. As a matter of fact, they always pictured that they were escaping religious persecution, just like the Jewish people did when they crossed the Red Sea. So they get here, everything's going fine. They decide to have a Thanksgiving. Now, where did the idea of Thanksgiving come from? Anybody want to take a guess? Our holiday of Sukkot.
God, you said it.
Our holiday of Sukkot. And here is something that will be absolutely amazing. What is the bird that we eat on Thanksgiving?
Turkey.
Turkey. Where did they come up with the name of turkey? Watch this. All documented, all true. Here we go. What occurred was, remember that Hebrew translator I was telling you about? Well, he came over to the New World and he saw a bird. That bird did not exist where they came from. Didn't exist. Nobody knew what it was. He looked at the bird and said, wow, that looks like a peacock. The Hebrew word for peacock, anybody want to take a guess?
Turkey.
Turkey. A little bit of a different accent. Turkey. So he calls out, Turkey, Turkey. And now we use that in the English language as the English word for turkey. So when next time you have Thanksgiving or you have a turkey, remember now you know at least, if not more, one word of Hebrew and you actually know what it means. So the pilgrims came over and they began to develop the United States of America. And they began to develop laws, and they began to develop many things, as well as medicine, because Christopher Columbus had a doctor, a surgeon on his boat. Anybody care to guess what religion that surgeon was?
Jewish.
A Jewish doctor. So all of a sudden, we now began to understand what Judaism had to do with that whole doctors and where it initially came from. All right. So then they're settling in, and by the way, they developed what we today call an HOA. So what does that mean? They developed laws to live by in their community.
I can't get up.
And the first set of laws, or one of the earlier set of laws, was done during the Puritan Revolution. And during the Puritan Revolution, which was in England, by the way, they replaced English common law with biblical laws of the Torah, believe it or not. And when they came over here in 1639, they were the first assembly of New Haven. Okay. They needed laws. They developed 75 laws years later in 1655, and they developed 79 laws. Care to guess where half of those laws came from? The Torah. They actually took laws in New Haven from nobody that was Jewish. They were not born Jewish, they were not raised Jewish, but they learned Judaism. And when they developed the laws of 1655, known as the Capital Laws of New England, they were almost entirely based on Mosaic law, meaning Jewish law, years later. So before I continue, did you have any idea that the original set of laws in the United States of America were in fact Jewish?
No.
No. Now that you know, how do you feel about that? Do we take pride? Does it change your opinion of the United States? Does it change your opinion of Judaism? Do you take pride? What's your reaction when you hear that?
Got a
Amazement.
question on this.
Go ahead,
Was it
Mr.
mainly
Eisenberg.
Was it mainly civil law or criminal law that
Yes.
you think was invented by the Jews?
Yes, both.
Both, because there's a
Both.
big difference.
I know. Yes, because Jewish law covers both civil, religious, and governmental laws, and any type of category of law that you want to think about was originally written by, in writings by Jewish people. So yes, absolutely. The answer to that is yes, which I'm going to get to. And Ira Sandberg writes, Torah is Old Testament, so most Christians would know and respect Torah law. Absolutely correct. Not only that, in the beginning of the Old Testament and in the beginning of the Quran, guess what books appear in the beginning of the Quran and in the beginning of the New Testament? The Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So it is not only ours, although we started with it, it is part of the text of many, many other religions, as well as the laws. Now, someone
Andy,
said,
is this subjective or is this actually proven?
this is actually proven. This is not subjective. This is not theory. This is proven, written down in history books. And to make it even more credible, someone said earlier when I asked, what do you think the influence is on Jewish people in America? You said education. You have no idea how correct you were. Why? Many, many, many years ago, the Jewish people, long before they came to the United States, they invented what was known as public school. Everybody else had private schools where you had to pay for it. The Jews said, everybody is entitled to an education, and they developed, outside of the United States first, a public school system that was duplicated by many countries. When they came over to the United States, and I'm not even going to talk about it, I think in those days that we were lucky to have 700 Jews. So the non-Jews came over and developed the public school system. And just to show you how popular Hebrew is, in the colleges that they developed, Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, Rutgers, Princeton, Brown, King's College, now known as Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and Dartmouth, what language do you think they taught there?
Hebrew.
Hebrew. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the logos of some of these universities today, what language are some of those logos in? Hebrew. Believe it or not. Not only that, there's one of the colleges, which is Yale, and they have a seal. And that seal is the exact same seal from the Torah that the high priest Aaron wore. And they put that on there. Now, make it even better. Many people who graduated from those colleges, they gave speeches or commencement speeches. This is a rhetorical question coming up. What language do you think they gave those speeches in?
Can't be Hebrew.
It is Hebrew, Jerry.
So who can
Hebrew.
understand them?
Very good. Because Hebrew was a required course. It was a required course in many of the colleges. And if you don't believe that, I'm going to throw one other fact that you think is be shocking. When the Congress went ahead and began to select, before they called the Congress, whatever it was, before they did that, they were looking at languages to become the official language of the United States of America. And they examined every language that people knew at the time: French, English, Spanish, Latin, Hebrew, the whole thing. And they narrowed it down to 2 languages. Rhetorical question. Care to guess which 2 languages made it to the finals?
Hebrew and English.
English
Hebrew
and
and English. English won out. Now, can you imagine today if Hebrew was the official language of the United States of America? It came very, very close. Not only that, when they began to develop the seal of the United States, they were, and this came in second place, they were going to have a picture of the Jewish people crossing the Red Sea as a picture of freedom. And that came in second place, but hidden in the seal, and if I can find one, I'll show it to you, are little resemblances toward Judaism. And that basically is the beginning. In the 16th and 17th century, Hebrew was a dominant language with, by the way, many of our founders spoke the language. It was not just loaned.
You just cannot allow Scotty Miller with 8 seconds on the
I'm going to mute that. I muted it. Okay, so the Jewish people and their Hebrew language was known by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and a few others. And what they were going to be putting on the seal was something called resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. And they were going to put that around the seal. So much influence that you basically didn't know. All right, here's another one. How many of us have been to the Liberty Bell? Anybody been to the Liberty Bell? Yep. Now I'm going to test when you were in school. What does it say on the Liberty Bell? Anybody remember? All right, here we go. It says the following: proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all its inhabitants thereof. And where does that quote come from? Our Torah, the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, sentence number 10, in case you didn't know. Now, it even gets better. If there were no Jews in the United States, I'm going to make a statement, and people can challenge me on it. The United States of America would not be in existence today for 2 reasons. Number one, George Washington did not have was running out of money to fund the revolution. He was running out of money. And there was this very wealthy individual.
I don't know why this is doing it.
Okay, there was a very wealthy individual, and his name was Chaim Solomon. He was one of the richest people in America. He lived in Philadelphia. And of course, he was Jewish. Okay, George Washington knew that. So what George Washington did, he went down to visit this man, Chaim Solomon. This is all written and true. Everything is true. And I'm going to embellish the story just a little bit for sake of enjoyment. So he gets off his horse, knocks on the door. Chaim Solomon opens it up. Chaim Solomon said, George Washington, welcome. And he says to George, what can I do for you? And George said, I need money. And he invited him in. And Chaim Solomon screamed at his wife. He said, Sarah, get the arugula ready and a good cup of tea. That part I made up. So they all went ahead, Chaim Solomon and George Washington. George Washington had a Jewish appeal like you've never seen before. So much so that after the conversation, George Washington got 95% of Chaim Solomon's wealth. He wrote him a check, and 95% of his money went to the revolution. And we're talking in our money today, millions and millions of dollars. But ladies, let me ask you this question. If you were Chaim Solomon's wife, and your husband comes into the kitchen, or you're even sitting there with your husband, and says, honey, I want to give up our fortune for the United States of America. We're going to be left with bupkis. We're going to be poor. I'm giving it all away. Ladies, what would you have done?
Would have created revolution in my house.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I would have done a revolution in the house.
You would have done a revolution in the house. Remember, a man doesn't write a check unless he's got the wife's approval, right? I don't know about the wives not writing a check if they don't have the husband's approval. I'm not going to get into that story. But what happened was she said yes.
Of course.
And they died in bankruptcy. That's story number one.
How did he earn his money?
If I remember right, through the garment industry.
What year are we talking about?
Well, the revolution, 1700s, whenever that was.
So he came over with this money.
No, he earned it here. No, he earned it here. Like most Jews, you build a business up, you earn it, you become very wealthy. All right, it gets more. Now, you might have heard this story, but for those that haven't, it's important. So you remember the from school, the Battle of Valley Forge?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and that was a turning point of the war. Okay, got it. One night, George Washington, for the last day of the battle, rounded up all his lieutenants and said, tomorrow I am signing a declaration of surrender. We cannot win. It is not going to happen. I'm not going to sacrifice all these soldiers that are on the valley floor. And they said, you're right, we can't win. This is all documented, and later on I'll tell you where. And that night, he sent an email and a text message to all his soldiers. Good, I got somebody listening. He sent a message by horse to all his soldiers and said, turn off your lights tonight. Nobody keep a light on, because we are on the valley and the British are around us and we don't want them to see where you are. And of course, everybody turned off their light, except for one guy. One guy. And because the only tent had one with a light on, George Washington got in his horse and went down, opened up the cloth to the tent, saw the light, and said to the person, didn't you understand? No lights. Turn it off. And this guy, whose first name was David, said the following, I can't. Tonight is the first night of Hanukkah. George Washington looks at him and says, so, this is Hanukkah? He didn't know what it was. And David explains to him what it is. And what he explained to him was that the Maccabees were totally outnumbered. And as a result of that, they practiced guerrilla warfare. And the way the Maccabees won is all documented in something called the Book of the Maccabees. And this guy, David, knew it. So he shared the battle plans with George Washington. George Washington heard it all, went back to his lieutenants, woke them up, and says, we are not going to surrender, and we are going to fight the same way the Maccabees did. And they did, and they won. If you don't believe this story, this exact story, as well as the battle plans that were used, are taught today in the Naval Academy to people who want to become officers. So therefore, for those two reasons and many more, the United States of America would not be in existence today because they ran out of money, and we would have lost the Battle of Valley Forge, and we absolutely would have lost the war as a result of that. And by the way, in 1654, that's when the first Jews arrived, only 23 of them. And in 1776, and I just explained to you what the Jewish influence was leading up to that year, there were only 2,000 Jews in America. And look at the influence that we have had. Is that amazing or not amazing? What do you think?
Amazing.
It gets better. You haven't even heard anything yet. It gets better. So, John Adams, George Washington loved the Jews. Even so that George Washington made a pledge. And George Washington said the American people will never, ever be allowed to forget the Jewish contribution to this country. And when George Washington passed, they began to develop and print money, paper money. Everything in those days used to be in coins, paper money. And if you take out a dollar bill, on the back of every dollar bill is a hidden Magen David, is a hidden Jewish star, because the creators of the money remembered the pledge that George Washington made. And it's on the back of every dollar bill. All right, just to show you how it worked. And in 1820, by the way, there were only 6,000 Jews in the United States. So let's now, somebody asked me about the government. Where did we ever come up with the idea of a House of Representatives, of the Senate, of local government, of the President of the United States having to be a born resident of the country? And the answer is, believe it or not, in the Torah. In the Torah, it clearly spells out the way the government should be formed. And as a result of the Puritans handing down what they learned from the Sephardic Jews, our Congress being separated by senators and representatives, and the president being a confirmed resident of the United States, was in fact built into our laws. Now you're asking me, I never heard of such a thing. So at this time, I would say, if you're learning all of this for new, which is great, that's why I love doing these things, that's why the Educational Committee loves doing these things, I recommend the following. Please find the principal of your Hebrew school and ask them for your money back, because they missed a big part of your education. So here goes. In the United States of America, there is 435 districts. The idea of district elections was implicit in the Torah, for it says the following: select for yourselves men. They didn't say women at the time. I apologize for that. It did say men. I can't change what it wrote. Who are wise, understanding, and known to your tribes, and I will appoint them as your leaders. And the word election obviously comes from the word elect, which means men of high intellectual and moral character. So what they did in those days, remember they had 10 tribes, and for 40 years they were traveling through the desert. Every one of those tribes had representatives who began to develop the laws and represent their tribes. By the way, what's the difference between a tribe and a state? Not much. It's an individual group of people, because every tribe had their own borders. So that's where they got the idea to develop the House of Representatives. Wow. Then they had the idea to select from the Senate, which means have less people from each tribe that are God-fearing men of truth and hate injustice,
And that was also described in the Torah, where it says, choose out of your midst men whose character can only be known by their lives. And that is where the idea of the representatives and the senators came from. But watch this. How many of us have ever been to the Supreme Court building? Anybody been to the Supreme Court building? Yep. What is written on top of the Supreme Court building and inside? Anybody remember? Here we go. Justice, justice, justice shall you pursue. And where does that come from? The Jewish Torah. Because that is exactly what was written. And the Supreme Court is America's version of what Judaism used to call the Sanhedrin. And what was the Sanhedrin? That was the high court. And believe it or not, you had the regular court. Watch this. You had the appeals court and you had the Supreme Court, known as the Sanhedrin, to resolve issues that the appeals court and the local court couldn't. So you had, someone asked me about the different branches. I think it was Mr. Eisenberg. So you have the judicial and you have the representatives. What I didn't get to yet was the president. So why does the president have to be born in the United States? Because in the old days, when Israel was ruled by kings, they had a law. And what was the law? The king had to be Jewish. Didn't necessarily have to be born in Israel because it was a diaspora, but it had to be Jewish. When they crafted the Constitution, they took that by saying, okay, therefore we cannot decree what kind of a religion somebody has to be president, but they have to be born in the United States of America. So now you see from the laws of the United States how everything is forming from the beginning laws of New Haven, from this language of the Hebrews, from George Washington's United States survival and growth as a result of the Jews, and how the government was formed around ancient Jewish tradition and ancient Jewish books. Now, someone might and should say, are you making this up, Andy? Or are you making this up? Because I never heard of this before. The fact of the matter is, it is not made up. It is documented in hundreds of books, but it is not taught a lot. Why isn't it taught? I'm not quite sure. But it's not taught. Most Jewish people, when I do this type of a discussion, had no idea. Why not? I don't know, but whatever, now we know. So, here's something else that Jewish law says. Listen to this. No legislation should be imposed on the public unless the majority can conform to it. And that means when somebody in the legislature is about to vote on something, who are they supposed to contact? Their constituents. They are supposed to represent their constituents and not their own thoughts. Now, whether that's working today in government, I'm not going to talk about politics. None of that's not really why we're here. So that whole issue has been put together. And the Knesset in Israel is basically formed the same way, although they've got something totally different that's involved. And, excuse me, as I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court is built on Jewish tradition. Now, there are many laws today in the world, in the United States, I should say, that also came directly from Judaism. For example, can you, in fact, convict someone in American court? I don't know if anybody here is a lawyer, but can you convict somebody without at least having evidence or witnesses? No. The idea of witnesses came from the Torah. And watch this. If there is a witness, what does the opposing counsel try and do? They search the person's background
and they do whatever they can to find something wrong to make the individual a non-credible witness. Now, guess where that idea came from, if you don't already know? Judaism. Because when you have a trial, the witnesses themselves have to be 100% credible and not have any background that would impede their honesty and their credibility. All right, I want to make this interactive. I've been babbling for a while. So somebody asked me some questions, tell me I'm full of malarkey, give me some reactions. Someone want to start me off?
I have a question for you.
Go ahead, Mr. Eisenberg.
If the United States Senate, or let's call it the machinery of government, which you just described, Senate and so on, with the president, was the process that evolved from the Jewish religion, then how come the government of Israel represents more like the government we have in Canada or in the United Kingdom, which is completely different? Because I won't go into the details of it, but there's no like 4-year terms. It's question of confidence of the government falls if you don't have the confidence. If you have a financial bill that doesn't pass, the government falls, and so on, which is what Israel has, what we have, what England has. So how come the US is different?
Very good question. So the answer is, in ancient Judaism, there was no such thing as elected presidents or prime ministers. In ancient Judaism, the Torah says that you're supposed to appoint kings. And that's where they had King David, King Solomon, and everybody else, until that particular way of government turned out not to be good, because many of these kings, by the way, were awful. They were corrupt. They were not looking out for the best interests of their people, and that caused a lot of division and civil war and the whole 9 yards. Okay, so to answer your question, there is no real answer other than the fact that when Israel was started and the people came over from foreign countries to start the whole economy and to start the whole government, they started out with kibbutzim, and they had a socialist way of forming that government. Okay, but some of the Torah laws still apply. Watch this. Before Israel can do any type of an attack, and they still do this today, they cannot do that until the chief rabbi of Israel buys into it. And if the chief rabbi of Israel says you are violating Jewish law, I will not allow you to do this, then they don't. Now, how many times that has happened, I have no idea. But there are things in Israel that still follow Jewish tradition, but that form of socialist government started out as socialist government, started out as a result of the Exodus and people coming into Israel. Good question. Other questions? Go ahead, Jerry.
When they were building the government, the Constitution, were there any Jews involved in that?
Very good question. So the answer basically is maybe one or two. It was not overly done with Jews sitting there, the Jewish influence was certainly there. Okay, but and as you can tell, how the government was formed and the whole 9 yards. Now, here's something else that's really interesting. But before I do that, more questions. Remind me if I don't get to it. I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence, because there's another story there. Other questions, objections, concerns, reactions? Okay, so they had the Declaration of Independence. They wrote it here. Got it. Understood. They had to send that back to England because it had to be presented to the king. And what they had to do was ship it from the United States over there. Now, did they ship the original one? No. The original one is obviously in the museum. But in order to make sure that nobody captured it, and this is all documented, they took the English version of the Declaration of Independence, translated it
into Hebrew and put it on a ship to send to England. Why? Because if it got captured, nobody basically would know what it says. Okay, it arrived there safely. They had a Jew on the other side, translate it back into English, and presented it to the king that we are declaring our own independence. And every one of these stories, we have an expression in Judaism called a Baba Misa. These are not Baba Misas. These are actual facts. And, excuse me, these are actual facts. So, not only that, but there were many American generals and many American lieutenants who were fighting in the Civil War and who created battle plans in the Civil War. The problem became Jew was fighting Jew. So what do I mean by that? There is some evidence to suggest, which we keep hidden, that the African Americans were brought over to the United States on ships. We know that. They didn't have airplanes. Guess who owned those ships?
The Jews.
The Jews. And in the South, the Jews in the South believed in slavery. They had slaves. Now, some people know that George Washington had slaves. We're not going to get into that. But the Jews had slaves, and they had the African-American slaves. And I often wonder, the Southern, by the way, is anybody here from the South before I get into this? Eileen, are you? Okay. So what the Jews had, you guys are? Okay, so you might want to check your history books on this. What the Jews used to do on Passover, they did what? They had a Seder. All right? And what is the Seder? Celebrating freedom from slavery. So can you imagine it's time for the gefilte fish and you call your slave and say, serve me now? Rather hypocritical. But that's what we did. And when the war broke out, Civil War, we had Jew fighting Jew, Jew planning battle against Jew, and the Jewish people in the South actually referred to the Torah to say that we are allowed to have slaves. Because guess what? I hate to say this. In the Torah, slavery is legal. Jew may own slaves. So we both impact, when I say we, the Torah, both impacted the South and the North. All right, let's move on. Ellen, Ellen's iPad, you want to say something? Because you kind of lit up. Okay, so
Yes,
go ahead.
yes.
Go.
But the Torah also outlines how to treat a slave that a Jew owns in a humanistic manner.
Yeah, yes. Which, by the way, it still does not eliminate slavery. In other words, you have to give them housing and food, but you don't have to pay them.
Yes.
So, yeah, and as a matter of fact, a Jew was allowed to have another Jew as a slave without getting into all the details. All right, so let's move on. Let's go to the 1900s. And actually, no, I'm going to change it. Let's go into the 1800s. And in the 1800s, there was Christmas and there was Hanukkah. This is all true stories. And here's how Judaism impacted the religion and the United States. Number one, hate to say this, but I'm very proud of it, who basically invented the retail business in the United States? The Jews. Gimbels, Macy's, Corvettes, Bloomberg's, all of them, all were Jewish. Okay, so around Christmas time, all the non-Jewish kids got what? Christmas presents, right? And what did the little boys and girls get? Little candies, Hanukkah gelt. So the story goes that the Jewish kids came home around Christmas time in the late 1800s, and all their non-Jewish friends were getting presents. And they organized. And they went to their parents and said, you know what? I don't want to be Jewish anymore. Parents said, why? Why don't you want to be Jewish? What's wrong with being Jewish?
He said, well, look at my Christian friends. They got this holiday. They get they get all these presents. I want to be Christian. I want to get presents. Ha! So what do you think the parents of these Jewish kids said?
Boy,
Right? They gave him presents because prior to that, Jewish kids did not get presents for Hanukkah. So that was one way to keep the religion going. All right, let's go to the 1900s, and I'll show you how Judaism impacted where we are today. How many of us, and I know we all know this, did women have good working conditions when they were working in the United States? No. Did they have equal rights when they were working in the United States? No. Guess what representative religion started the women's movement to give them all types of freedom? The Jews. And then when they were finished with that, they got very heavily involved in the labor unions. And they began to form the labor unions, or become very crucial to its formation. And they began to develop the civil rights. And I think many of us know this. When Martin Luther King had his march on Selma, the very famous Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, marched with him. And the speech before Martin Luther King's in Washington, a Jewish rabbi gave a speech. And then Martin Luther King followed. But here is where it becomes a Jewish influence. Many of the words, not all, many of the words used by Martin Luther King came from the Torah. And as a matter of fact, when the Civil War was going on, and even back in the 1600s, there were lots of songs that the African Americans began to sing for freedom. And nearly every one of those songs was related to the Jews leaving Egypt. They called Martin Luther King a modern day Moses. They called George Washington in those days a modern day Moses. And there were songs about Pharaoh, let me free, and about 6 or 7 of them had to do directly with here it is. I am bound for the promised land, turn back Pharaoh's army, go down Moses, and let my people go. These were all songs that motivated the African Americans, and they have a direct relationship with the Jewish people leaving Egypt. And to continue with it, what you'll also find is way back when there were spiritual coded messages that were sung in the ancient days of America, and it said the following: "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan." Overseers believed they were worshiping the white God. So if we take a look at the United States today, and I'm not going to talk politics, parties, presidents, that's not what we're here for. But if we take a look at the people that the new president has put into power, it is amazing how many of them are Jewish. Anytime you want to have a minion, all you got to do is take Biden's nominees and call them in and have them in. It is absolutely amazing that 3 of the Supreme Court justices today are Jewish. It is absolutely amazing how many Supreme Court justices throughout the history of the United States are Jewish. And when you start from the beginning, as we did, and you come up to modern day times, you got to say the following: what do we call ourselves in the United States? A Judeo-Christian society. And which one of those two comes first? They don't say Christian Judeo, they say Judeo-Christian. And what does the Judeo stand for? Jews. I'll pause again for questions, comments, reactions, observations, challenges, anything. So you're accepting everything that we have. Okay, great. So, Jerry, if I may, you learned a lot tonight, right?
Yes.
Okay. So now that you know this stuff, is this something you feel should be shared with other Jews? Or should we do what we've always done and keep it quiet and bury it and not let us at least share it?
I think it should be shared.
And ever wonder why it wasn't?
Yeah, of course. If you're living in a non-Jewish community, it's not something you would particularly share.
Uh-huh.
If you're living in a heavily Jewish community like Bellagio,
Yeah.
it should be shared. A lot of people do not know most of this.
Yeah, and not only Bellagio, a majority of the Jewish population, no matter where they live, were never taught this stuff. And I think because we're afraid to have known. Roz, if I may, and I'm just going to go around the room for a little bit. Roz, was most of this new to you, and do you think it should be shared?
Yes, most of it was new, and I do think it should be shared, but I don't think it should only be shared with Jewish people. I think it should be shared with all people. I think knowledge helps to teach you respect for someone else's faith, whatever it is.
Ah, okay. So if I may, just for the sake of conversation, okay? There are a lot of non-Jewish people that say the Jews are taking over the country anyway. With Biden's nominations, with the so many Jews in the Congress, which are way higher than our percentage of population, so many in the Senate and around governments, and all the Jews in broadcasting. In case you didn't know, by the way, just off the record, CBS, NBC, ABC were all developed by Jews. All the major Hollywood studios were developed by Jews. We don't even want to talk about the banks. Most of the investment companies were Jews. So would this not give ammunition to those that say we're taking over America, additional reasons to promote anti-Semitism?
No.
Okay. All right.
I disagree. There are people here who are so set in their ways. I mean, you now have the white supremacists who set up offices right here in Palm Beach. There's a lot of pros and cons on that. I don't know if teaching this is going to create more animosity and more problems. Don't know.
Interesting. Mr. President, Ken, what do you think?
Taking his brain.
And I'm not asking you to send this out. Don't worry.
No, I just listening to all that you said, I'm wondering how, if we started in such a good, strong Jewish tradition, how did we wind up where we are with the Electoral College not really working, with Congress not really working, with the white supremacists that Maris just mentioned taking hold and being so anti-Semitic? I mean, where did it all go wrong?
Oh, wow. All right. Well, that's a whole different political discussion for probably Stu Fleischer's group, if he still does it, as current events or whatever. So, yeah, it's a great question.
Are you giving these other groups more ammunition? I mean, you have all these tragedies in the synagogues and different places that they're attacking. So I don't know. It's a really difficult question to answer. Do you say that we should know? Yes, I think that we should know, we should educate, but it's also a fine line.
Interesting. Thank you. Mr. and Mrs. Eisenberg, what do you guys think?
Well, I think that you always run the risk if you draw attention to something like you just mentioned with Biden's cabinet, although people may subliminally realize this. If suddenly you saw this big headline on Fox, Jews are taking over the government or something, you can imagine, I shouldn't say Fox, it may be maybe they wouldn't do that, but certainly a group would do that. And you're running the risk of drawing very negative attention. After all, if you look at the origins of Nazism and the big lies that were told there, it basically, Hitler and his group said, well, the Jews gave away the armistice in World War I, and that was the reason the German people were so broke and so forth, and they just kept repeating it. So if at this point you raise something like that, which as Jews make us feel proud, as someone else, they may not be. And do you want to run that risk is really for whatever benefit you would get by telling them this.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Anyone else want to contribute to the discussion? All right. So I'm going to surprise you about something off topic because I mentioned all the things that do anybody have their hand up? I thought I saw somebody with their hand up. Okay. So go ahead. Unmute yourself if you would, Aileen, and we're more than happy to hear what you have to say.
According to Jewish law, can you hear me?
Yes.
The fact that the Jews did have slavery back then, but they had something called the 7 years. If you were a slave, whether you were Jewish or not Jewish, after 6 years, on the 7th year, you were automatically given your freedom. And I just wanted to add that to your.
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes, the 7-year period. Yes, you're absolutely correct. And thank you for including that in the discussion. Yep. Thank you for including that. But you also had a right, if you were a slave, to say I want to continue to be a slave, and what you had to do was go through a little ceremony where they put an auger in your ear and to let people know that you decided to remain a slave. So that if you liked where you were and you liked your master, you still maintained the right to stay there. But you had to have this big permanent auger put in your ear. So here's something that's a little bit off topic, but it'll shock you, but it also affected America's history. Here we go. How many of us are familiar with comic books? Yep. And you know Superman and Batman and Green Lantern and Aquaman and Thor and all of them, Captain America, the X-Men and all of those. Guess what? Every single one of them that I just mentioned, with the exception of Wonder Woman, who I didn't mention, was originally created by Jews. And one of the reasons why the American people were not adverse to getting into World War II, one of the reasons, was because a Jewish person developed a character by the name of Captain America. And he was developed at the time that Hitler was rising in power. And if you go on the internet, I don't have it in front of me, but if you go on the internet, the cover of Captain America, as drawn by a Jew, was in fact Captain America punching Hitler in front of all his comrades. And the comic book itself was designed to provoke Americans to fight against Hitler. And that and many other reasons. That's not the sole reason, but that and many other reasons, and many of the comic book heroes at the time were developed by Jews to attempt to influence the mainstream Jewish person to go and help the Jews. As a matter of fact, one of the X-Men, actually she was a woman, and her name escapes me for a second, but it'll come to me. Every comic strip she's in, she wore a Magen David. Not hidden, but open. So that was another way.
We were in Ohio and we went to Superman's original house, the creators of it, the two young men who created the comics.
Right.
And we were at a lecture in a synagogue and we met the aunt of the creators. And originally they did not have a shirt on. He just had the S on his body. And then they told me he had to put a shirt there and the creation. It was very, very interesting how we met her and how they talked about it. And it's a little town right outside of Cleveland, Ohio that they're from, the boys. They sold the comic strip for $35, by the way. And the family sued, I think the descendants sued Marvel Comics to get more money because obviously it made millions of dollars from it.
So did they tell you that the character of Superman, or the origin of Superman, was fashioned around Moses?
No, but they said also the, what was the gem that he had that had the superpowers? No, they didn't say it was based on Moses, not at
All right,
all.
well, here we go. And then we'll end with this story. This is all factual. I don't make this stuff up. It's all factual. And for those of us that are familiar with the story of Superman, his name was Jor-El, and he was the son of Kal-El, and that's the way he was introduced. By the way, in the Jewish religion, when you're called up for an aliyah, or your name is called out in a Mornis Kaddish or whatever, it's the person whose father was. So there's the first clue. Kal-El, the son of Jor-El. Aha. What does Kal-El mean? Kal-El in Hebrew means the voice of God. Okay, no big deal. But we're getting there. So the planet, for those of us that remember, was going to explode. All right, I got it. So what did they do? They put little baby Superman in a little rocket, and they covered this guy with a blanket. Okay, and they pushed the button, and he went to planet Earth, and he got raised by strangers, and he got superpowers. Okay, so what does that have to do with Moses? Very simple. If you go back to the historical book of Exodus, how did Moses begin? He was born. He was supposed to be killed because the Pharaoh said all the firstborn babies died. Okay, got it. So what did the parents do? They put him in a little basket. By the way, that rocket ship, if you look at the cartoons, looks like a little basket. And what did they cover Moses with? A blanket. And he went down the Nile River. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace when the mother was there and the whole 9 yards. And then he grew up to have superpowers backed by God, who gave him the powers to do all the 10 plagues. So the story is they developed the Superman character in the beginning around Moses. So there you have it. So before we conclude, any comments or ideas or anything else that you'd like to add or question? Okay. Well, it was
Sandy,
certainly.
do you think that this should be taught more publicly as far as the creation of, you know, the Jews were so influential in starting the United States? And do you think, besides Hebrew school, that everybody should learn this? Your personal
That is my belief. Yes, because it has nothing to do with spirituality. It has nothing to do with attending services. It has nothing to do with anything. But it does give us the pride of knowing what our contributions are to the formation of the United States. And I always find it interesting. And I know some people want to go and say, if you want to leave, I'm not going to be insulted because our time is up. I understand that. So what I always find interesting, to answer your question, we have in America called Black Heritage Month. It's a wonderful thing. Believe it or not, May is Jewish Heritage Month. Anybody know that? No. So what do we do in May that duplicates what the African Americans do in their Heritage Month? There's an expression called bupkis. We don't do anything. We don't do nothing. Most of us didn't even know it existed. And with that being said, we are my viewpoint, as long as you ask me a question, I'm not trying to preach. In my viewpoint, we're letting ourselves down by not knowing these things. Because there could be a Black Heritage Month that has all kind of information. I don't see any reason we can't do that to Jewish Heritage Month or do it throughout the year. Because
But are you familiar with the history of Black Heritage Month? I'm not. I mean, I know some things, but what I'm saying is, what about people from other faiths and stuff like that? Is this something they would buy into listening to this, or would it create problems?
Oh, okay. So my first answer is yes. I think more Jews should know about it and it should be taught.
That's different.
Should it be taught to non-Jewish people? You know what? I'm queasy about that. So my answer is, and I'm going to do a Jewish answer. It depends. So if they want to come to us to learn it, I'm cool with that. But are we going to go out? Should we go out and proselytize it, which is something we don't do as Jews? The answer is no. Okay. Should we include it in Holocaust studies? Of course not. Okay.
But if somebody wants to come and say, hey, what have you guys done for America? Or I heard this rumor or whatever. Yeah, I'm cool with that. If they want to say, hey, how come some of the colleges have the Jewish Hebrew language on there? I'm cool with that. Fine, no problem. But I'm queasy about going out because it runs the risk of saying, oh, there go the Jews again. They're running the place, and that's why we got to get rid of them.
Do you know that on the Norman Tabernacle Choir, the building, the main building, they do have Mogen Day of the Jewish Star right there in the middle of the building?
Yes, and I attended a lecture recently, and I don't remember the whole thing, where the Mormon religion is so close to the Jewish religion, extremely close. And I'm not that adept in other religions, so I had to go listen to this. I wanted to listen to this lecture, but it's an amazing thing.
We were told when I asked that question, when we were taking the tour, they said it was just a pretty design. The people who were giving the tour, the knowledgeable people giving the tour, said it was just a design that was there, and didn't say anything more. It was under the covers.
Interesting. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions? All right. I hope you enjoyed this.
Thank you.
We've got another discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to start researching on the internet.
There you go. Cool. Take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Get your shots. And can't wait to see everybody in person again.
It would be nice.
Thank you very much. Really
You're
good.
very welcome.
Thank you. Thank
You
you,
learned
Jewish
a lot.
Heritage Club.
Good. Good. That's the purpose.
Okay.
Thank you.
And
Dorothy, how
4,
are your grandbabies,
3,
Dorothy Steinmetz?
2, 1.